Hello, and here we go with Erik Erickson and his stages of development. If you want to make sure you remember what you need to about Erik Erickson and what he studied, I think the first thing to focus in on is his name, Erik Erickson. A little like Mahali Csikszentmihalyi in that the name is in the first name and the last name, but for very different reasons. The general story basically goes like this. Erik's mom was married to a man, and he disappeared. He left her, and while she was still married to him, but the father, or her husband, I guess, was MIA, she ended up becoming pregnant and having a child. So when the child was born, he was given her husband's last name. So Erik was first called Erik Salomonson. The interesting thing about that, though, is that Erik, the Erik part of Erickson, was the last name of his biological father, but that was not the man that his mother was married to. So she gave him the name Erik after the biological father, and Salomonson after the man to whom she was married. The relationship to Mr. Salomonson didn't last that long, and ultimately Erik's mother will meet and marry another man. This guy's name was Theodor Hamburger, and Theodor wanted Erik Erickson to feel that he was Erik's father, so Erik's name was changed from Erik Salomonson to Erik Hamburger. So what I want you to notice is that there's multiple sort of identities that he started his life with, and they affected him. He was bothered by it. When he went to school, the kids teased him because his family was Jewish, but he was also Danish. He never felt like he really fit in. He didn't look like the other kids at school, and so he was teased and he felt like he never fit in. As a result, he spent his entire life searching for his true identity. And so what's interesting about his name, Erik Erickson, is that when he discovered that Theodor Hamburger wasn't his actual father and that he had the name Salomonson first, he was the one who ended up opting to take the last name of his biological father, which was Erickson. But since his first name was already named after his biological father, the name ended up Erik Erickson. So at the time that he immigrated to the United States, Erik Erickson was the name that he went by. And while he was here, he studied under Anna Freud, and you're going to see like there's some similarities and some big differences between Erik Erickson and Sigmund Freud, and yet his stages of development do line up in a similar way as Sigmund Freud's, although the conflicts and the way they resolve themselves are different. He's going to disagree with Freud over some pretty significant issues. Freud believed that it was life and death, aggression, instincts, sex instincts that would drive behavior, but Erik Erickson thought it was social interaction that drove behavior. And it makes sense considering that he spent his life kind of trying to understand who he was and find his identity and his role in his life. He's a pretty unique stage theorist, especially in this fact that his theory spans the entire life cycle. When you notice that Piaget's did not, Freud's doesn't, this one goes from birth until death. So Erickson took a psychosocial approach where Freud was a determinist. Erickson believed that it was biology and culture. It's interesting, though, I say Freud was a determinist, and yet he put a lot of focus on that mother-child relationship, but still believed in biological determinism. So Erickson believed that biology sets up what you're working with. So here's your starting place. Here are your constraints on the possible things that you can develop into. He also believed that your external genitalia would affect the type of play you engaged in. So if you gave children blocks or figures to play with and told them to make a scene, these are children about 10 or 12 years old, girls would form these enclosures and contain the little figures of people and animals within the enclosures. where boys would build high walls and tall buildings, and they would put their people and animals sort of outside these enclosures, thus looking at girls as being this biological, more inside people, and boys being more outside. Did believe it was biology that was causing these types of differences. He also recognized the importance of culture, that culture is necessary for us to know what acceptable behavior is. What customs we follow, what the boundaries are for acceptable behavior, when we can touch things and when we're not allowed to touch things. So biology is going to constrain when stage of development happens, but the culture is going to show you how it's solved. So I know at this point we haven't really discussed a lot of Freud. So just quickly, his iceberg theory, that whole id, ego, superego, which honestly you probably discussed in your English classes as like a lens. This is probably more useful in English class. That's an editorial note though. But your id is that part of you that is like that primary process thinking. It wants what it wants now. It's like your inner 2-year-old. It's aggressive, it wants sex, it wants to avoid death, that sort of thing. No thought given to consequences, long-term consequences. And the ego is the part of the personality that is both conscious and unconscious. And the ego, like the id will want something, and the ego is thinking of long term. Well, will this bring me long term pleasure, help me avoid long term pain or death and destruction sort of thing? And so if the id says it wants something, the ego can check it back and say no, like that's not okay right now. And the superego is your moral compass. It's going to tell you what's right and what's wrong. Really, the only job that Freud gave the ego was to balance out what the id wants with what the superego will find acceptable. There was no need of its own. The ego had no needs like that. Erickson will disagree with this and say that the ego develops its own needs, such as wanting to make sure the physical and the social environment are in sync. The ego is going to keep adjusting itself over the lifetime. And so Erik Erickson is going to take that lifespan approach, straight from birth to death, broken up into 8 stages, where you have a conflict at each stage. So with the general sequence of stages, obviously you're working with genetics, and everything is going to have like sort of phases that it goes through. First, immature phase, where it's just existing. There's no real focus point. There's no real crisis, not yet. Then there's that critical phase where there is a focus. There is something there's a constraint put on you by biology, and there's a cultural influence that's coming in, and there's something that you need to resolve, and it could be good or it could be bad in terms of its results. Probably an all or nothing type of thing. Lots of experiences will add up. If more positive than negative, then you have a positive outcome. More negative than positive, you have a negative outcome. And the resolution is that outcome and how you kind of move on successfully or not into the next stage. So as you go through these stages, it will either strengthen or weaken your ego. If you have good resolutions, a lot of positive things, your ego will be strengthened. If you don't, it will be weakened. Virtue is really that thing that helps to strengthen a person's ego. For the ritualization versus the ritualism, I'm going to explain that at each stage as we go along. What you do want to understand are these stages. So stage 1, trust versus mistrust. This stage goes from birth to about 18 months, so about a year and a half. The main task at this stage is feeding. Children will develop a sense of trust when caregivers provide reliable care and affection. So this is the child's first big achievement, is learning enough to be okay when the caretaker leaves, because they trust and expect that the caretaker will come back. It is all right to have a little mistrust too, because no one should ever trust everyone. If you can form that trust, you have the courage to take risks, and you're not discouraged unduly by disappointments. Again, it doesn't actually matter who the infant forms the bond with, just so long as that they are forming this bond. That goes back to the attachment thing. So the good effect, the trust, the good effect, you get this positive feeling towards your mother or other caregivers, a positive feeling towards being social in general. The too much effect, the ritualism, you get this excessive admiration or blind hero worship instead of warm feelings towards others. Stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is from about age 1.5 to 3, and the main task here is toilet training, potty training. The child is going to be developing a lot of skills like walking, talking, holding, and letting go of their bowel movements. There will be a battle of the wills between the child and the parent. The child will become more independent, will try to exercise that. The parent's going to have to try to control the child's behavior so that it's socially acceptable without crushing their sense of independence. So they could be overprotective or unjust with punishment, and the child will be doubtful and ashamed. One of the things you want to watch when you're raising your children is that you don't want to be that bubble wrap parent. You don't want to be too overprotective, but you do want to keep them safe. You don't want to criticize them too harshly. Just address the behavior and not to them, and and gently guide towards something else. Otherwise, they doubt their own abilities to do stuff. Also, you want to teach them personal responsibility. You see sometimes like a kid will trip and fall on the floor, and the parent will be like, bad floor, bad floor. And it's like, no, it's okay that they fell, and that's all right, and it's no big deal, and they'll learn not to do that, because you want them to have that sense of, hey, I can control some things, and I just fell, and I did that. That good stuff, that ritualization here would be learning right from wrong, learning the laws of the culture, internalizing them, learning to judge themselves and others by their own rules and moral judgments. On the ritualism side, you have this preoccupation with rules instead of the reasons for the rules, and instead of understanding something. You become too black and white in your thinking. So stage 3, initiative versus guilt. So imagination versus limits. This is around age 4. Well, it could be like 3 to 5 or 4 to 5. Basically the preschool years. And the main task here is exploration. Will need to begin asserting control and power over their environment. Success in this stage will lead to a sense of purpose. Children who try to exert too much power will experience disapproval, resulting in a sense of guilt. For these reasons, imaginative play is extremely important at this stage. Kids should not fear starting new things. They should be able to learn to start taking care of themselves without fearing punishment. So on the good side, the ritualization side, they'll feel authentic. They'll engage in role playing and find a mix of roles that is good for them. And those roles will help them adapt to different circumstances in their life. The bad side, the ritualism, you have that sort of impersonation. So confusing playing a role with a real personality. Stage 4, industry versus inferiority, happens approximately age 6 to 11, and the main task here is going to be school. Children are going to need to cope with the new social and academic demands. Success in school will lead to a better sense of competence. And failure will make a child feel inferior. That's why it's so important to put kids in classes, particularly at these young ages, where they can feel successful, where they are appropriately placed. And I'm really mindful of this as a parent, that, if my kid fails at something, sometimes I find it interesting what they might make mistakes with, or what they can or can't do. And sometimes I just want to call my mom and tell her about it. One of them did this or didn't do that, or they said this, or whatever it is. But I love my kids, and even when they mess up, I'm kind of intrigued by it, and it's interesting, and it's all part of the learning and being part of life. And if they were to overhear me talking about them in this stage, they get very embarrassed. And sometimes you think you're telling like the cutest story, like a misunderstanding of a word or just something. And they get horribly embarrassed by that sort of thing. It does make them feel incompetent. And so I still want to talk to my mom and tell them about like some of the things that they said and did, but I want to make sure I do that out of earshot. So maybe I will do that when I'm walking the dog and not while I'm home and they can hear me. Because what they don't know is that I delight in it. They will find it embarrassing, and I don't want them to question their own competence. So good results at this age, or the ritualization here, would be this formality, learning how things work in one's culture, what skills and knowledge are necessary for certain tasks, and feeling like you're capable of doing it. On the negative side, the ritualism side, you get this formalism, this preoccupation with work, no interest in why things work, just do things a certain way because that's the way they have to be done, and that's the way they've always been done. You don't question things. So stage 5 is identity versus identity or role confusion. And this is really adolescence, so about age 12 to 18 to 20 years of age. This is considered that transition time between childhood and adulthood. And that transitory time is called a moratorium. A person here must make a decision about the type of life they want to lead, a career, general strategy for life. They try to find their own identity, their own role in life. No pressure here, huh? And there are some possible problems, like you could have an identity crisis, so having trouble figuring out who to be. This is actually, by the way, pretty normal for everybody. And if you leave this stage without this feeling of an identity, Erickson said there are a couple ways that can go. You could have role confusion, which essentially means that you're prolonging that moratorium, which again, remember that transition time between childhood and adulthood, you could stay there forever just by failing to choose a role, according to Erickson. You could have a negative identity, which would be adopting an identity that you've been warned against by your culture, by society. And that fidelity value, I feel like I should explain that here. That's just about finding your place in society, knowing the expectations of society, the laws, that sort of thing, that they have imperfections, but you're basically willing to follow the rules that are put in place and stay loyal to your society. So again, that good result, that ritualization, is you embrace this philosophy of life, a strategy for living, whether it's philosophical, religious, political, won't matter. And that bad effect, that ritualism, you embrace sort of this simplistic idea of heroes, and you don't really consider if these heroes have values that you should or really be wanting to follow. So stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation, and it does look like I made a mistake on this slide, so let me fix this. The ages aren't, it's like 19 or 20 to, not to 24, thankfully not that, 19 or 20 to about age 40. Sorry. Typos, man, you know I never do that. Anyway, the main task here would be forming close relationships and gaining a capacity for love. So according to Erickson, young adults would need to form this intimate, loving relationship with other people, often romantic, but doesn't have to be, and success would lead to strong relationships. And a failure would result in this feeling of loneliness or isolation. The idea that you can fuse your identity in some ways with other people or someone else. And you can't do that unless you have a strong sense of identity in the first place. Success, that ritualization, would be affiliation, this intimate relationship that you can have with other people. And the sort of too much, the ritualism, the bad effect would be that kind of elitism, that superficial relationships with a small group of people categorized by snobbery and status symbols and membership instead of real intimacy and companionship. Stage 7 is the generativity versus stagnation. And once again, here's that same mistake. I must have just copied that over. It's not 25 to 64, it would be from ages 40 to 64. The main task at this stage would be working and parenthood. Adults need to create or nurture things that will outlast them. So often by having children or creating a positive change that benefits other people. In other words, you just need to feel like you're leaving something to the world, you're contributing something to the world. Here you're trying to, this generativity is trying to pass on, your lifestyle, your societal setup, or whatever to the next generation. So the concern here is for future generations. That's your generativity. The stagnation side is getting self-absorbed and caring only about yourself. Here you should really have a widening concern for others. On the ritualization side, you get this idea of transmitting your cultures and your values to the next generation. And on the ritualism side, you are using your power for selfish gain. So you're being authoritarian. Ultimately, people in this stage want to feel that they've done something useful, that they've had some accomplishments that will outlast them. And lastly, stage 8, this ego and integrity versus despair. And this would last from about age 65 until death. The task here is really to reflect on your own life. Older adults want to look back on their life and feel a sense of fulfillment. that a success at this stage will lead to feelings of wisdom, and failure at this stage will result in regret, bitterness, despair. Here, people can look back and think of all the major goals that they had in their life that they didn't achieve, which can be extremely distressing. So the ritualization side of this is this unification of your previous ritualizations. Life has contributed to some immortal culture, something that will absolutely surpass your own life. And in that way, you live on. The ritualism side, you have this pretense of being wise, since you didn't actually contribute a lot to society and your life didn't have that much meaning. You feel the need to look wise. As we evaluate Erickson, we have to know that his labels for stages are not actually appropriate across all cultures, like that autonomy stuff. But he was one of the first theorists to recognize that development occurs past adolescence. And his research actually caused a lot of people to try to research things in these different areas. So this particular stuff spawned a lot of other research. And I know we haven't gone over Freud's psychosexual stages yet, and I will. But I want you to just notice how the first 4 stages of Erickson stuff line up with the first 4 stages of Freud's psychosexual theories.